At 01:30 hours on August 21, 1942, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki crouched in the darkness at the edge of a coconut grove on Guadalcanal, watching his 900 elite soldiers prepare for an attack he believed would take less than 2 hours. The humidity was suffocating even in the pre-dawn darkness. Mosquitoes swarmed through the tropical air, the smell of rotting vegetation mixed with the salt tang of the nearby ocean. Somewhere ahead, across a shallow tidal lagoon the Americans called Alligator Creek, the enemy waited. Ichiki could not see them in the darkness, but he knew they were there. It did not matter. They would not be there for long. Ichiki had studied his enemy for years. He knew what every Japanese officer knew about Americans. They were soft. They were pampered by their wealthy nation, raised on Hollywood movies and jazz music and all the decadent pleasures their industrial society could provide. They had no warrior tradition, no code of honor, no willingness to sacrifice themselves for a greater cause. Japanese military intelligence had concluded that American soldiers were, and these were the exact words used in official assessments, haughty, effeminate, and cowardly. They had no stomach for fighting in rain or mist or in the dark. Ichiki himself had reportedly referred to the United States Marines as effeminate and cowardly. He had spoken these words to his officers before they left their ships, reassuring them that the coming battle would be swift and decisive. His soldiers needed no such reassurance. They were veterans of China, hardened by years of combat against an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1. They knew what it was to fight and win against impossible odds. They had never known defeat. The colonel was so confident in Japanese superiority that he had refused to wait for the second half of his regiment to arrive. His orders from Imperial General Headquarters had specified that he should wait for reinforcements. Before attacking the airfield the Americans had captured, why bother? His 900 men would be more than enough to sweep these soft Americans into the sea. By dawn, the airfield would be back in Japanese hands. By noon, the remnants of the American force would be dead or fleeing into the jungle, where disease and starvation would finish what Japanese bayonets had started. Ichiki checked his sword one final time. It was a family heirloom, passed down through generations of warriors. Tonight it would taste American blood. What happened over the next 17 hours would shatter everything the Japanese military believed about American fighting men. By the time the sun set on August 21st, 800 of Ichiki's soldiers would be dead. His elite regiment would cease to exist as a fighting force. And the myth of Japanese invincibility on land, carefully cultivated through 8 months of unbroken victory across Asia and the Pacific, would lie broken in the blood-soaked sand of a misnamed creek in the Solomon Islands. The story of how one arrogant colonel led his men to annihilation begins not on Guadalcanal, but 7,000 miles away, at a bridge outside Beijing 5 years earlier. On July 7, 1937, Japanese soldiers of the China Garrison Army conducted a nighttime training exercise near the Marco Polo Bridge on the outskirts of Beijing. The bridge was an ancient stone structure, built in the 12th century, spanning the Yongding River. Japanese forces had been stationed in the area since the Boxer Protocol of 1901, which gave foreign powers the right to maintain troops near Beijing. Relations between the Japanese garrison and the Chinese forces guarding the nearby town of Wanping were tense, but had remained peaceful for years. That night, the Japanese soldiers fired blank ammunition into the air as part of their training drill. When the exercise ended, one soldier was reported missing. The Japanese commander demanded permission to search the nearby Chinese town. The Chinese refused, viewing the demand as a violation of their sovereignty. The Japanese commander who escalated this incident into a full-scale military confrontation was Major Kiyonao Ichiki. The missing soldier was found within hours. He had simply wandered off to relieve himself and lost track of his unit in the darkness. But by then, Ichiki had already ordered his men to open fire on the Chinese positions. The Marco Polo Bridge Incident, as it came to be known, triggered the Second Sino-Japanese War, a conflict that would eventually merge into the larger conflagration of World War II. Within months, Japanese troops had captured Shanghai after brutal urban combat and marched on Nanjing, where they committed atrocities that shocked the world and remain controversial to this day. Ichiki was never punished for his actions at the Marco Polo Bridge. In the Japanese military culture of the 1930s, aggressive action was rewarded, even when it exceeded orders or created diplomatic complications. Initiative and fighting spirit were prized above caution and restraint. Ichiki had demonstrated both, and his career prospered accordingly. By 1942, he had risen to the rank of colonel and commanded the 238th Infantry Regiment, part of the 7th Division based in Asahikawa on Hokkaido, the northernmost of Japan's main islands. His regiment was one of the most experienced units in the Imperial Japanese Army, trained for cold weather operations but equally capable in tropical conditions. His men had fought across China for years. They were disciplined, battle-hardened, and believed absolutely in their own superiority and in the divine destiny of the Japanese Empire. They had never been defeated in battle. The concept of defeat was literally unthinkable to them. In June 1942, Ichiki's regiment was assigned to capture Midway Atoll, a tiny pair of islands in the Central Pacific that held enormous strategic significance. The plan was simple. Admiral Yamamoto's combined fleet would lure the American aircraft carriers into a trap and destroy them. Once American naval power in the Pacific was eliminated, Ichiki's men would land on Midway and seize the islands, extending Japan's defensive perimeter thousands of miles closer to Hawaii. But the Battle of Midway became a catastrophe for Japan. American codebreakers had deciphered Japanese naval communications and knew exactly when and where the attack would come. American dive bombers caught 4 Japanese aircraft carriers with their flight decks full of armed and fueled planes. Within minutes, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were transformed into blazing infernos. All 4 sank beneath the Pacific waves. The Midway invasion was cancelled, and Ichiki's regiment was ordered back to Japan to rest and refit. They never made it home. On August 7, 1942, approximately 11,000 United States Marines landed on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and Florida Islands in the Solomon Islands chain. The Marines captured an airfield the Japanese had been building on the northern coast of Guadalcanal, a flat stretch of cleared jungle that would soon become one of the most fought-over pieces of real estate in the Pacific War. Japanese high command was stunned. This was the first American ground offensive of the war. It had to be stopped immediately, before the Americans could consolidate their position and turn the captured airfield into a functioning air base. Ichiki's regiment was the closest available unit. His transport ships were diverted from their course to Japan and redirected toward the Solomon Islands. His orders came directly from Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. Land on Guadalcanal. Recapture the airfield. Drive the Americans into the sea. Japanese intelligence estimated that only about 2,000 Americans had landed on Guadalcanal, and most of those were believed to be construction workers and support personnel rather than combat troops. The assessment was based on aerial reconnaissance that had spotted few American soldiers in the open and no large ships in the waters around the island. Japanese officers concluded that the Americans had probably withdrawn most of their forces after completing their initial landings. The assessment was catastrophically wrong. There were actually 11,000 Marines on Guadalcanal, and they were some of the best trained infantry in the American military. The 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General Alexander Vandergrift, had spent months preparing for offensive operations. Many of the junior officers and enlisted men were young and had never seen combat, but they had been trained to exacting standards and were eager to prove themselves against the enemy that had attacked Pearl Harbor. But Ichiki did not question the intelligence reports. He did not send scouts ahead to verify the size of the American force. He did not request updated aerial reconnaissance. He did not need to. He knew what Americans were: effeminate, cowardly, incapable of standing against Japanese fighting spirit. The intelligence reports confirmed what he already believed, and that was enough. On the night of August 18th, 6 Japanese destroyers of Destroyer Squadron 2 slipped through the darkness of the Solomon Sea and approached the eastern coast of Guadalcanal. The warships carried Ichiki and 916 men of the first echelon of his regiment. A second echelon of approximately 1,200 additional soldiers would follow in the coming days. The destroyers arrived at Taivu Point around 1 in the morning on August 19th. The landing was uncontested. No American ships challenged the Japanese approach. No artillery fire greeted them on the beach. The men waded ashore through warm, shallow water and assembled in the darkness without incident. Ichiki was supposed to wait at Taivu Point for the second echelon to arrive. His full force of over 2,000 men would give him a much better chance against whatever Americans he might encounter. His orders specifically stated that he should not attack until his regiment was at full strength. He chose not to wait. As soon as his men were ashore and organized, Ichiki radioed his headquarters in Rabaul, the main Japanese base in the region. "We have succeeded in invasion," he reported proudly. Then he added a second message that revealed his absolute contempt for the enemy he faced. No enemy at all, like marching through a no-man's land. It seemed to Ichiki that the cowardly Americans were avoiding contact, hiding in their positions around the airfield rather than patrolling aggressively as Japanese soldiers would have done. Ichiki left a rear guard of about 100 men to protect his supplies and equipment at Taivu Point. With the remaining approximately 800 soldiers, he began marching west along the coastal trail toward the airfield. They moved through the darkness in a long column, confident that victory was only hours away. What Ichiki did not know was that the Americans were waiting for him, and they knew he was coming. The first warning came from American codebreakers. The same cryptanalysts who had broken Japanese naval codes before Midway were still monitoring enemy communications. On August 8th, Station Hypo, the Naval Intelligence Unit in Hawaii, intercepted a message connecting Ichiki's unit with Destroyer Squadron 2. 6 days later, on August 14th, another intercept revealed that the Ichiki detachment's destination was the naval code designation RXI. American intelligence knew that RXI meant Guadalcanal. The message also indicated that the Japanese force would arrive around August 18. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, immediately notified Major General Vandergrift to expect a Japanese attack as early as August 20th. The Marines had time to prepare. The second warning came from the jungle itself. On the morning of August 19th, Captain Charles Brush led a 60-man patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines along the coastal road, east of the marine perimeter. The patrol had been prompted by a warning from Father Arthur Duhamel, a Catholic priest from Massachusetts, who had lived on Guadalcanal for years. Duhamel had told the Marines that a large Japanese force had landed somewhere to the east. The Marines moved carefully through the dense jungle vegetation. The heat was oppressive, even in the morning hours. Sweat soaked through their uniforms. Insects buzzed around their faces. Every rustle in the undergrowth could be an enemy soldier or just another jungle creature. The patrol reached the area near Coley Point around noon and stopped to eat and rest. That was when they spotted the Japanese. A reconnaissance patrol of 38 men, including several officers, was walking casually along a trail, not even in military formation. Ichiki had sent them forward to scout the American positions and establish a communications base. They clearly had no idea that American Marines were anywhere nearby. Captain Brush reacted instantly. He split his force, sending the main body to attack from the front, while one platoon swung around through the jungle to cut off the Japanese escape route. The ambush was devastating. The fight lasted less than an hour. All but 5 of the Japanese soldiers were killed. The Marines suffered 3 dead and 3 wounded. When Brush's men searched the Japanese bodies, they found documents that changed everything. Maps showed detailed Japanese intelligence of Marine positions around the airfield. Papers identified the dead men as belonging to the 28th Infantry Regiment, a unit far larger than a mere patrol. The documents did not specify exactly how many Japanese were on the island or when they planned to attack, but they confirmed what the codebreakers had already warned. A major assault was coming from the east. General Vandergrift ordered his defences strengthened immediately. Colonel Clifton Cates, commander of the 1st Marines and a veteran of the brutal trench fighting at Belleau Wood in World War I, directed his regimental commanders to prepare for an attack from the eastern perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, was assigned to hold the most likely avenue of Japanese approach. Pollock was a no-nonsense Marine, a veteran of the Banana Wars in Central America, where he had learned the brutal realities of jungle combat. He studied the terrain east of the marine perimeter and identified the critical defensive position. Alligator Creek, a tidal lagoon that flowed into the sea, formed a natural barrier across the coastal approach to the airfield. At its mouth, a narrow sandbar about 50 feet wide and 100 feet long connected the two banks. Any attacking force coming from the east would have to cross that sandbar to reach the marine positions. Pollock positioned his men along the west bank of the creek. His battalion stretched for 2,700 yards, 1,000 yards along the coast, and the remainder covering the lagoon's western bank. Marines from the 2nd Battalion dug fighting holes in the soft earth, clearing fields of fire through the jungle vegetation. They strung a single strand of barbed wire across the sandbar. They positioned machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire that would turn the sandbar into a killing ground. Two 37mm anti-tank guns from Battery B, 1st Special Weapons Battalion, were placed to cover the sandbar. The gunners loaded them with canister rounds, ammunition originally designed for use against tanks but devastating against infantry. Each canister round contained 122 steel balls that would spray out in a deadly cone when fired, turning the small cannon into a giant shotgun. Artillery batteries behind the line zeroed their guns on the east bank of the creek. Among the Marines waiting in the darkness was Private Al Schmid, a 21-year-old metal worker from Philadelphia who had enlisted in the Marine Corps 2 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Schmid had worked at the Dodge Steel Company before the war, burning steel with a cutting torch. He was engaged to a girl named Ruth Hartley, a salesgirl he had met in May 1941. Before shipping out, he had used a $60 bonus from his employer to buy her an engagement ring. Schmid was assigned as the assistant gunner on a .30-caliber water-cooled Browning machine gun, part of the 11th Machine Gun Squad, Company H, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. His crew commander was Corporal Leroy Diamond, a Jewish Marine from Brooklyn. The gunner was Private First Class Johnny Rivers, a Native American from rural Pennsylvania. The 3 young men had trained together at New River, North Carolina, and had become friends during the long voyage across the Pacific. Their position was on the west bank of Alligator Creek, directly facing the sandbar that any attacking force would have to cross. They had constructed their gun pit from sandbags and coconut logs, camouflaging it with palm fronds and jungle vegetation. The machine gun's barrel pointed across the 50 yards of murky water toward the darkness on the far bank. The Marines dug in, checked their weapons, and waited. They did not know exactly when the attack would come, but they knew it was coming soon. The third warning came from a man who should have been dead. Jacob Vouza was in his 40s in August 1942. He had been born in Tassimboko on Guadalcanal and had spent most of his adult life as a police officer in the Solomon Islands Protectorate Armed Constabulary, the colonial police force that maintained order in the British-controlled islands. He had risen to the rank of Sergeant Major, the highest position available to an indigenous islander, and had retired in 1941 after 25 years of service. When the Japanese invaded the Solomon Islands in early 1942, Vouza came out of retirement. He volunteered to work with the Coast Watchers, a network of observers organized by the Royal Australian Navy to report on Japanese movements throughout the Pacific. The Coast Watchers were a mixture of Australian military personnel, colonial officials, and indigenous islanders who hid in the jungles and mountains, watching enemy ships and aircraft, and radioing intelligence to Allied commanders. Major Martin Clemens, a Scottish district officer who commanded the Coast Watcher network on Guadalcanal, recognized Vouza's value immediately. The sergeant major knew every trail and village on the island. He could move through the jungle like a ghost. He commanded the respect of the local population. Clemens assigned him to lead a brigade of native scouts. On August 7th, the same day the Marines landed on Guadalcanal, Vouza proved his worth. An American pilot from the aircraft carrier Wasp had been shot down over Japanese-held territory. Vouza found him hiding in the jungle, evaded Japanese patrols, and guided the pilot safely to American lines. It was his first contact with the Marines, and he immediately offered his services as a scout. The Marines were grateful. They gave Vouza a small American flag as a token of their appreciation. He tucked it into his loincloth and wore it proudly. It was a gift from his new friends, the American warriors who had come to drive the Japanese from his homeland. On August 20th, Martin Clemens sent Vouza on a scouting mission behind Japanese lines. The sergeant major was to locate the enemy force that had landed at Taivu Point and determine its size and intentions. It was a dangerous mission. If he was captured, the Japanese would show him no mercy. Vouza moved through the jungle with the skill of a lifetime spent in these islands. He avoided Japanese patrols, gathered information on enemy positions, and began making his way back toward American lines. Then his luck ran out. While crossing a stream, he was swept off his feet by the current and carried downstream, right past a Japanese patrol that was waiting on the bank. The Japanese soldiers dragged him from the water and searched him. They found the small American flag hidden in his loincloth. There could be no doubt about his loyalties now. The soldiers tied Vouza to a tree and brought him before an English-speaking officer. The interrogation began. Where were the American positions? How many Marines were on the island? What weapons did they have? What were their defenses? Vouza refused to speak. He would not betray his friends. He would not help the enemy who had invaded his homeland. The Japanese tortured him for hours. They beat him with rifle butts. He said nothing. They slashed his face and arms with swords. He said nothing. They bayoneted him repeatedly in the throat, the chest, the shoulders, the stomach. Still he said nothing. The Japanese officer taunted him throughout the torture. He told Vouza that his Marine friends would die that night. He described in detail how the Japanese would attack, where they would cross the American lines, how they would slaughter the soft, cowardly Americans. The officer was confident that the emotional pain of knowing his friends would die might break Vouza when physical pain had failed, finally believing Vouza was dying or already dead. The Japanese left him tied to the tree and marched off to join the main column advancing toward the Marine perimeter. Vouza did not die. After his captors were gone, he began to chew through the ropes that bound his hands. His throat had been slashed, making breathing difficult. Blood poured from multiple wounds. Every movement sent waves of agony through his body. But he kept working at the ropes until finally they parted. He fell to the ground and lay there for a moment, gathering his strength. Then he began to crawl. For nearly 3 miles, Jacob Vouza dragged himself through the jungle toward the Marine lines, determined to warn his friends that the Japanese were coming. He reached the Marine perimeter just before midnight. Sentries found him collapsed at the edge of the 2nd Battalion's position, barely conscious, covered in blood. They carried him to Lieutenant Colonel Pollock and Martin Clemens. Before he would allow anyone to treat his wounds, Vouza gasped out his warning. 250 to 500 Japanese soldiers were coming. They would attack the sandbar position. They would strike within minutes. Then finally he allowed the corpsman to take him to the field hospital. Vouza would receive 16 pints of blood and spend 12 days in the hospital. Against all odds he would survive. Major General van der Grift personally awarded him the Silver Star for his refusal to give information under Japanese torture. The Marines also made him an honorary sergeant major in the United States Marine Corps, a title he would carry with pride for the rest of his long life. But that was in the future. Now, in the darkness of August 21st, the Marines had perhaps 10 minutes to prepare for the assault Vouza had warned them about. The word spread quickly along the line. Officers checked their men. Machine gunners made final adjustments to their weapons. Riflemen settled into their foxholes and peered into the darkness across the creek. Everyone waited. At 0130, the first Japanese wave burst from the coconut grove on the east bank of Alligator Creek. About 100 soldiers charged across the sandbar, screaming and firing their weapons. Green flares arced overhead, casting an eerie glow across the battlefield that turned everything the color of sickness and death. Japanese officers waved their swords, urging their men forward. The soldiers ran in a crouched position. Bayonets thrust forward, shrieking battle cries that echoed across the water. They were meant to terrify the soft, cowardly Americans into fleeing from their positions in panic. The Marines did not flee. They had been trained for this moment. They had been waiting for this moment. They held their fire until the Japanese were halfway across the sandbar, committed to the crossing with no cover and no way to retreat. Then they opened fire. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous roar of rifle fire and machine guns that seemed to merge into a single enormous explosion. The 37mm guns fired canister rounds that tore into the charging soldiers with devastating effect, spraying steel balls into the packed mass of Japanese infantry. Tracers streaked across the water like deadly fireflies. The Marine machine guns traversed back and forth across the sandbar, cutting down anyone who remained standing. Japanese bodies piled up on the sandbar. Men fell on top of men. Some soldiers tried to crawl forward over the bodies of their comrades, only to be cut down themselves. A handful made it to the barbed wire on the Marine side and threw themselves at the obstacle, trying to tear it apart with their bare hands. They were killed at point-blank range. A few Japanese actually made it across the wire and reached the Marine positions where they fought hand-to-hand before being overwhelmed. The first attack collapsed in minutes. Bodies lay scattered across the sand, some half buried in the churned earth, others floating face down in the shallow water. The survivors fell back to the coconut grove on the east bank, dragging wounded comrades with them. Any competent commander would have recognized that the frontal assault had failed. The Americans were not fleeing, they were not cowardly. They were dug in, well armed and clearly prepared for exactly this kind of attack. A sensible officer would have pulled back, reassessed the situation, waited for reinforcements, and tried a different approach. Colonel Ichiki was not a sensible officer. He was a believer. He believed in Japanese superiority. He believed in the power of fighting spirit to overcome material obstacles. He believed that courage and determination would always defeat soft Western enemies who lacked the will to sacrifice themselves. He ordered a second assault. At 02:30, between 150 and 200 Japanese soldiers charged the sandbar again. This time they came after a mortar barrage that crashed down on the Marine positions. The Marines simply huddled in their foxholes until the shelling stopped, then rose to meet the attack. Once again, the Marines held their fire until the attackers were committed to the crossing. Once again, the carnage was horrific. The 37mm guns fired so many canister rounds that their barrels glowed red-hot in the darkness. Machine gun barrels overheated and had to be changed. Riflemen fired until their shoulders ached from the recoil. At the machine gun position on the west bank, Johnny Rivers was feeding ammunition while Al Schmid spotted targets and called directions. Corporal Diamond coordinated their fire, directing them toward the thickest concentrations of attacking infantry. The Browning hammered away, its water-cooled barrel allowing sustained fire that would have burned out an air-cooled weapon. Then a burst of Japanese bullets struck Rivers in the face. He died instantly, falling back into the gun pit with his eyes open and staring at nothing. Schmid felt rage burn through him. Rivers had been his friend. Now he was dead, killed by the Japanese soldiers still pouring across the sandbar. Schmid shoved Rivers' body aside and took over the gun, pressing his face against the stock and squeezing the trigger. For the next 4 hours, Schmid fired continuously as wave after wave of Japanese soldiers tried to cross the creek. Diamond reloaded belts of ammunition until a bullet shattered his arm, rendering it useless. Now Schmid was doing both jobs, firing and reloading, keeping the gun in action even as Japanese bullets shredded the water jacket, and the barrel began to overheat dangerously. He fired in short bursts to prevent the weapon from jamming, but the barrel glowed red despite his efforts. Around 0500, Ichiki tried a different approach. He sent a company of soldiers into the ocean surf to wade around the eastern end of the Marine line. They would come up the beach and attack from a direction the Americans were not expecting, but the Marines had anticipated this possibility. Machine guns and the 37mm guns swung to cover the beach approach. The Japanese emerged from the surf into a storm of fire. Dozens died on the wet sand before they could advance more than a few yards. Bodies washed up on the shore and lay half buried in the sand, moved by the gentle waves. Every attack failed. The cowardly Americans would not break. The effeminate Marines stood their ground and killed anyone who tried to cross the creek. The beach was littered with Japanese dead. The sandbar had become an open grave. The water ran red with blood. As dawn approached, Ichiki ordered his surviving men to pull back into a coconut grove about 200 yards east of the sandbar. He had no intention of retreating. Japanese soldiers did not retreat. They would fight to the last man, as their orders commanded. They would hold their position until reinforcements arrived or until they were all dead. What Ichiki did not realize was that the battle was only half over, and the worst for his men was yet to come. At Al Schmid's machine gun position, A Japanese soldier who had crawled through the carnage during the night finally reached the Marine lines. He rose from the darkness and threw a grenade directly into the gun pit. The explosion wounded Schmid in the shoulder, arm and hand. Shrapnel tore into his face, destroying one eye and severely damaging the other. There was a blinding flash, then only darkness. Schmid could not see. Blood poured down his face. The pain was agonizing, but he could still hear Corporal Diamond's voice calling out targets despite his own wounds. The battle was not over. Japanese soldiers were still attacking. His friends were still fighting. Schmid found the machine gun by feel and got behind it again. Using Diamond's directions and his own sense of the battlefield, the blinded Marine continued to fire. When he felt Diamond punch his arm, he knew to shift his aim. When Diamond stopped talking, Schmid reloaded the ammunition belt by touch, his fingers finding the mechanism through years of training and hours of combat. He kept fighting until he was finally relieved at dawn. He passed out from exhaustion and blood loss as other Marines carried him to the rear. When he woke up in the field hospital, he learned that he was permanently blind. The doctors could do nothing to restore his sight. Schmid would later be awarded the Navy Cross for his actions that night. Estimates suggested that his machine gun alone had killed over 200 Japanese soldiers. But the personal cost had been enormous. He was 21 years old and would never see again. While Schmid was being carried to the rear, the Marines were preparing to finish what Ichiki had started. At daybreak, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 1st Battalion, 1st Marines crossed Alligator Creek upstream from the battle site. They waded through the sluggish, 50-foot wide stream in water up to their chests, holding their weapons and ammunition above their heads. On the far bank, they formed up and began moving through the jungle toward Ichiki's position. Cresswell's men swung around to the south and east, cutting off the Japanese line of retreat. The coconut grove where Ichiki's survivors had taken refuge was now surrounded on 3 sides. The ocean was at their backs. There was nowhere to run. Aircraft from Henderson Field, the captured airfield the Japanese had come to recapture, roared overhead shortly after dawn. The runway had been completed just the day before, and the first American aircraft had landed only hours earlier. Now those planes were in the air, providing direct support to the Marines on the ground. Grumman Wildcat fighters from Marine Fighting Squadron 223 strafed the Coconut Grove, with 50 caliber machine gun fire. Douglas Dauntless dive bombers added their firepower to the destruction. Japanese soldiers who tried to escape down the beach were cut down from the air. Then the tanks arrived. 4 light tanks from 1st Tank Battalion rumbled across the sandbar and into the Coconut Grove. The light tanks were small by armoured standards, weighing only about 14 tons, with thin armour that could be penetrated by anti-tank weapons. But the Japanese infantry had no effective anti-tank weapons. They had not expected to face American armour, and they had nothing that could stop the steel monsters now rolling toward them. What followed was a slaughter. The tanks swept through the Coconut Grove, firing 37mm cannon and multiple machine guns into clusters of Japanese soldiers. Richard Tregaskis, an American war correspondent who watched the attack from the Marine lines, later wrote that it was like a comedy of toys, something unbelievable, to see them knocking over palm trees. But there was nothing comedic about what happened to the men in the grove. Group after group were flushed from cover and shot down by the tanks' canister shells. Some Japanese soldiers tried to stop the tanks by climbing onto them and attacking with swords and grenades. The tankers had practiced for this. They maneuvered close to each other and raked their companion tanks with machine gun fire, killing the Japanese clinging to the hulls. The tanks did not merely shoot the Japanese. They rolled over the bodies, both living and dead, crushing them beneath their steel treads. When General Vandergrift inspected the battlefield later, that day, he wrote that the backs of the tanks looked like meat grinders. By 1700 hours, Japanese resistance had ended. The Coconut Grove was a charnel house. Bodies lay everywhere, some piled 3 deep. The tropical heat was already causing decomposition, and the stench of death hung over the battlefield like a physical presence. Colonel Ichiki did not survive to see the end. The exact manner of his death remains disputed to this day. Some accounts say he was killed leading a final charge across the sandbar in the pre-dawn darkness. Others say he survived the night battle but was killed during the tank attack. Still others maintain that after the battle was clearly lost, He gathered his surviving officers, burned his regimental colors to prevent their capture, and then committed ritual suicide by shooting himself. What is certain is that Kiyonao Ichiki died in that coconut grove on August 21, 1942, along with most of the men he had led to their deaths, of the 917 soldiers who had landed with Ichiki at Taivu Point. Only 128 survived the battle. Approximately 774 to 800 were killed, depending on the source consulted. This represents a casualty rate of approximately 87% in a single engagement. Only 15 wounded and unconscious Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner. About 30 managed to escape through the jungle and reach the rear guard at Taivu Point. The Marines lost between 34 and 44 killed and approximately 75 wounded. The casualty ratio was staggering. For every American who died, nearly 20 Japanese soldiers perished. It was an annihilation so complete that Japanese headquarters initially refused to believe the reports. When the first message reached Rabaul on the night of August 21st, Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Matsumoto, the operations officer who had met with Ichiki before his departure, told the commander of the 17th Army that it was a false report. It did not seem possible that Colonel Ichiki, a veteran he knew personally, had been killed along with most of his regiment. The message from the survivors at Taivu Point was simple and devastating. The first echelon of the Ichiki detachment was almost annihilated this morning at a point short of the airfield. The reaction in Rabaul was disbelief, followed by shock. The invincibility of the mighty Imperial Army had been shattered. The haughty, effeminate, and cowardly Americans had not only stood their ground, they had destroyed an elite Japanese regiment in a single night. The Battle of the Tenaru, as it came to be known despite being fought at Alligator Creek, rather than the actual Tenaru River 2,000 yards to the east, was the first major land victory for American forces in the Pacific War. From Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal, a span of 8.5 months, the Japanese had seemed unstoppable. They had captured Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, Wake Island, Guam, and dozens of other Pacific territories. Their soldiers had defeated British, Dutch, Australian, and American forces in battle after battle. Now, for the first time, the Japanese had been beaten decisively on the ground, and beaten badly. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. For the Americans, the battle proved that Japanese soldiers could be killed in large numbers when they attacked prepared defensive positions. The mystique of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated through months of unbroken victory, evaporated in the blood-soaked sand of Alligator Creek. General Vandergrift wrote to the Marine Corps Commandant, Lieutenant General Thomas Holcomb, after the battle. "These youngsters are the darndest people when they get started you ever saw." For the Japanese, the shock was even greater. Their entire military philosophy was built on the idea of spiritual superiority. Japanese fighting spirit, they believed, could overcome any material disadvantage. The Yamato spirit, the ancient warrior code of Japan, would always triumph over soft Western soldiers who lacked the will to sacrifice themselves for a greater cause. Courage and dedication would defeat any enemy, regardless of numbers or weapons. Ichiki had embodied that belief. He had dismissed his enemy as effeminate and cowardly. He had refused to wait for reinforcements because he was certain his men would sweep away whatever Americans they encountered. His confidence was not mere arrogance, it was doctrine. It was what every Japanese officer had been taught since childhood, and it had led 800 men to their deaths in less than 17 hours. Japanese commanders did not learn the right lessons from the disaster. Instead of recognizing that frontal assaults against prepared positions were suicidal regardless of the attacker's fighting spirit, they concluded that Ichiki had simply not brought enough men. The solution was to send more troops and try again with greater force. 3 weeks later, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi attacked the marine perimeter with approximately 6,000 soldiers at what became known as the Battle of Edson's Ridge, or Bloody Ridge. He came much closer to success than Ichiki had, nearly breaking through the American lines in brutal hand-to-hand combat that lasted for 3 nights. But he too was defeated, with over 800 Japanese killed. In October, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake himself came to Guadalcanal with approximately 20,000 troops and launched yet another major assault. Once again, the Japanese attacked prepared positions. Once again, they died in enormous numbers. The Battle of Henderson Field cost the Japanese nearly 3,000 killed. The pattern would repeat itself throughout the Pacific War. Japanese commanders kept ordering frontal assaults, confident that spiritual superiority would overcome machine guns and artillery. American Marines and soldiers kept killing them in devastating numbers. The terrible exchange ratio at Tenaru, where the Japanese lost nearly 20 men for every American killed, would be seen again and again at islands across the Pacific. The Battle of the Tenaru also revealed another grim reality that would characterize Pacific combat for the rest of the war. Japanese soldiers almost never surrendered. Of the approximately 800 Japanese killed at Alligator Creek, only 15 wounded and unconscious men were taken prisoner. Even then, some of those prisoners died of their wounds or refused medical treatment. More disturbing was what happened after the main fighting ended. As Marines walked through the coconut grove examining the battlefield and collecting souvenirs, wounded Japanese soldiers who had been playing dead suddenly opened fire. Others grabbed grenades and tried to take their killers with them. 3 Marine officers, including Lieutenant Colonel Cresswell, narrowly escaped when a Japanese sergeant suddenly sat up and tried to shoot them. The Marines quickly learned that they could not show mercy to wounded Japanese soldiers. Any body on the ground might suddenly produce a weapon or a grenade. The grim practice of shooting or bayoneting any Japanese soldier who moved, regardless of whether he appeared wounded or dead, became standard procedure. It was brutal, but it saved American lives. General Vandergrift wrote to the Marine Corps Commandant about this phenomenon. "I have never heard or read of this kind of fighting," he explained. "These people refuse to surrender. The wounded wait until men come up to examine them and blow themselves and the other fellow to pieces with a hand grenade. This willingness to die rather than surrender, often taking Americans with them, would become one of the defining characteristics of Pacific combat." By February 1943, the Japanese evacuated their surviving forces from Guadalcanal. They had lost over 20,000 soldiers on the island, many of them to disease and starvation as American control of the surrounding waters cut their supply lines. The Americans lost fewer than 2,000 killed in action during the entire 6-month campaign. The campaign that began with Ichiki's arrogant assault had become a catastrophe for Japan, and it had begun the long, bloody road that would eventually lead to Tokyo Bay. The men who fought at Alligator Creek carried the memory of that night for the rest of their lives. Al Schmid returned to the United States in the fall of 1942 and underwent numerous operations on his eyes and face at the Naval Hospital in San Diego. Through the efforts of Virginia Pfeiffer, a Red Cross worker who helped him through his rehabilitation, Schmid began the long road back to some kind of normal life. He regained partial sight in one eye, enough to live actively despite his disability. He married his sweetheart, Ruth Hartley, in April 1943. His story was told in a book titled Al Schmid, Marine by Roger Butterfield, and then in a Warner Brothers film called Pride of the Marines, released in 1945, with actor John Garfield playing Schmid. The film brought his story to millions of Americans on the home front. Schmid and Ruth had a son and daughter, and lived quietly in Philadelphia before eventually moving to St. Petersburg, Florida. He took up fishing and learned to play the organ. He became an amateur radio operator. He never sought fame or attention, preferring to live as normal a life as his disability would allow. But every year, on the anniversary of the battle, Al Schmid would sit alone in his home, remembering Johnny Rivers, who had died beside him, remembering the long night of firing at enemies he could eventually no longer see, remembering what it had cost to prove that Americans were not cowardly after all. Al Schmid died of cancer in December 1980, at age 62. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, where he lies among the other heroes of American wars. Corporal Leroy Diamond, who had directed Schmid's fire even after being wounded, survived the war and lived to exchange letters with historians about his experiences well into the 1990s. He remained proud of what his machine gun crew had accomplished that night. Jacob Vouza became a legend in the Solomon Islands and among the Marines who served there. He continued to work with American forces throughout the Guadalcanal Campaign, serving as chief scout for Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's 2nd Raider Battalion during their famous 30-day patrol behind Japanese lines in November and December 1942. He received the British George Medal for gallant conduct and exceptional devotion to duty. He received the American Silver Star and Legion of Merit. In 1957, he was made a member of the Order of the British Empire. In 1979, Queen Elizabeth II knighted him, making him Sir Jacob Vouza. Vouza never forgot the Marines who had become his brothers in combat. In 1968, he visited the United States as the honored guest of the 1st Marine Division Association. He wore his Marine Corps tunic proudly whenever he met with American veterans, the uniform of the service that had made him an honorary member. He wore that tunic until his death on March 15, 1984. He was buried in it, as he had wished. Shortly before he died, he asked visitors to carry a message to the Marines he had served with so many years before. "Tell them I love them all. Me old man now, and me no look good no more. But tell them I love them all." Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock, whose 2nd Battalion had borne the brunt of Ichiki's assault, received the Navy Cross for his leadership during the battle. His citation noted that he had left his command post and advanced through severe enemy mortar and machine gun fire to direct the defense from the front line for 12 hours. Pollock went on to serve throughout the Pacific and Korean Wars, eventually rising to the rank of general. He commanded both the 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions and became the only man in Marine Corps history to serve as commanding general of both Atlantic and Pacific Fleet Marine Force. He died in November 1982, the same month as Al Schmid. A monument stands today near the site of the battle on Guadalcanal. The Japanese memorial reads, in part, Ichiki Party was organized in Asahikawa, Japan. They landed on this land in August 1942, and most of them were to die in fierce battle. We praise the soldiers of Ichiki and those of all nations who died here for their nation. It is our sincerest wish that the world will remain peaceful, forever without any more wars. Sadly, there is no American monument at the Tenaru, but the victory there echoed across the Pacific for the rest of the war. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki believed he understood his enemy. He believed that Americans were soft, pampered by wealth, unwilling to fight and die for their country. He believed that Japanese spiritual superiority would overcome any material advantage the Americans might possess. He believed these things so completely that he marched 800 men into a battle they could not win against an enemy he had catastrophically misjudged. 800 families in Japan received notices that their sons and husbands and brothers and fathers would not be coming home. 800 soldiers died in a single night because their commander believed his own propaganda. The lesson of the Battle of the Tenaru is the lesson of every military disaster caused by arrogance and underestimation of the enemy. When commanders believe they already know what their opponents are capable of, when they dismiss intelligence that contradicts their assumptions, when they let contempt override caution, when they substitute belief for analysis, the result is almost always catastrophe. Ichiki called the Marines effeminate and cowardly. They proved him wrong with rifle fire and machine guns and bayonets and tanks. They proved him wrong because they were not what he believed them to be. They were ordinary American men, some barely out of their teens, who had been trained to fight and who stood their ground in the darkness and killed anyone who tried to take it from them. The supposedly cowardly Americans buried Ichiki's regiment in the sand of Guadalcanal. And then they did the same thing to Japanese forces at island after island, for 3 more years, until the war finally ended in Tokyo Bay in September 1945. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.